I've always been a storyteller and a person who appreciates good stories. And I never really set out to become a writer or author. I think I just one day realized that you can only get together with people in a live setting and tell your story every so often. And a better way to try to reach a wider audience would be is if you can write those stories down and communicate them with the same emotion as you can when you're speaking.
It's my pleasure this evening to host this evening's first expert voice, which is Randy Miller. Randy is the class of 1993 and is a speaker, writer, and teacher of history, political science, and terrorism, and serves as an adjunct professor at Salem State University, as well as a Norwich professor within our own graduate program and also the Special Operations undergraduate program. So let's talk about the first book, Norwich Matters. So what gave you the idea? Why write the book?
For my entire life, we have these boxes in the attic, and they're full of American Indian artifacts. So there's pictures in there of Sitting Bull, there's tomahawks, there's peace pipes, there's all this stuff. We have no idea where it came from. My father just knows that it came from his great-grandfather. He inherited it. And after he retired, he finally started trying to find out, okay, why do we have all of this stuff? And went to the National Archives plenty of times, went to Rosebud out in the Dakotas, and he figured out that his great-great-great-great-uncle was a federal Indian agent. And that's where he had picked some of this stuff up. So it was very frustrating, especially with photos sometimes, trying to figure out who's in the photos. So he made a casual comment to me one day. He said, you should get all your Norwich stuff together and label who's who and maybe organize all your memories. And that was it. Everything spun out of control from there because I went up and I got my boxes and I started looking at all this stuff and the memories started coming back, and I started writing down notes and I started labeling pictures. And the next thing I knew I had found the archives up on the 5th floor here of Kreitzberg. And I went through every guidon from the 4 years I was here, and I just started sort of devouring things. And then I remembered a story, and it was about this guy, Irving Buffum. And supposedly he was one of the original Knight Riders, but he had somehow died during an initiation ceremony, pierced with a saber. You can tell already this is sort of ridiculous, and that he was buried in a shallow grave down by the Dog River. And I couldn't get that story out of my mind, and I thought, let's try to find this out. And with archives online, and the archives here, and Ancestry.com, it still took me about a week or so, because his name is Irving Newcomb Buffum. His name on his birth certificate is different from the name on his death certificate, which is different from the name on his probate stuff from court. I mean, it's an absolute mess to try to hunt all this stuff down. That's what started it. Major Ryan Welch is a AH-64 Apache pilot, and he was flying a routine reconnaissance mission over Baghdad when he could hear on the emergency frequency, he could hear a broken transmission. 2 OH-58 observation helicopters had gone down over a particularly bad area of Baghdad. As he came closer to the crash site, he was able to establish radio communications with 2 of the pilots who were on the ground. Tragically, the other 2 pilots had been killed on impact. Without waiting for backup or permission or anything, he landed his Apache, he grabbed his weapon, he stumbled around for 10 or 15 minutes in pitch darkness looking for the pilots, and when he finally found them, they were in very bad shape. They were both wearing their night vision goggles, so they were bleeding from the eye sockets from the impact. One of the pilots could barely walk. So Ryan got them back to his aircraft, which was waiting for him. Unfortunately, an Apache only has 2 seats in it, and there were 4 passengers that needed to ride out of the neighborhood. He took the pilot who was worse off and put him in his seat, and then he strapped himself and the other pilot to the outside of the aircraft. This is called self-extraction. This is something that pilots brief on all of the time, but nobody ever actually has to do this. After a 10 or 15 minute ride on the outside of the Apache, they arrived at the field hospital. They made sure they got both of the pilots inside, one of the administrative, corporal or whoever came over with his clipboard and said, okay, what medevac unit are you with? And he said, I'm not a medevac pilot, I fly Apaches. And nobody believed him. They had to follow him outside and see the aircraft as they flew away. The situation in Somalia in 1993 was a series of warlords jockeying for power positions. It's basically a failed state. You cannot find a better example of a failed state than Somalia in 1993. The United Nations task force was there. They had 30,000 Marines. They had a big presence. Things were relatively under control. After that United Nations task force pulled out, President Clinton authorized the creation of Task Force Ranger, which was an elite group of special operations soldiers, Rangers, Delta Force, SEALs, Night Stalkers from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The mission of Task Force Ranger in Somalia was to capture Adid, who was the head warlord at the time, or any of his top-tiered henchmen. They had captured dozens of these guys. They pulled off missions on moving targets. They pulled off missions in stationary buildings. They were very, very good at what they did. When they went in to do their mission on October 3rd, from the very beginning, things started to go wrong. One of the Rangers tragically fell from 60 feet as they were fast roping down to the street, and one of the Blackhawks was shot down by a rocket-propelled grenade. Tom DiDamasso was the Ranger platoon leader, first on the scene when the first Blackhawk went down. They stayed and they worked in two-man crews trying to cut the pilot out of the Blackhawk, and they wouldn't leave until they'd accomplished that. That happened to coincide with the sun coming up and what's now known as the Mogadishu Mile. So these guys had to exfiltrate on foot. As they did so, they were under fire from every doorway, from every window, when they were carrying their own dead and wounded until they got to safety in a nearby Olympic Stadium that had been occupied by, I think, Pakistani forces. Many of those guys ended up getting out of the military, going into different jobs after that experience, but Tom DiDamasso didn't. He stayed in and finished a 20-year career in special operations. What I was most struck by when I had the honor of meeting him and interviewing him for the book was that of all of the things he's done in his career, of all of the firefights, of all of the missions, he feels closest to his friends that he studied with and trained with at Norwich back when he was a cadet. Norwich is a relatively small community, and in the United States these days, it's less than 1% of the population actually serves in the military, so you're looking at a pretty elite group of people. But they're people first and foremost. And I think that's probably the reason why these stories, when I have the opportunity to tell them to other people and groups outside of that community, these stories resonate with people. It transcends that small population. Well, I like telling these stories because these are stories that nobody would ever hear if we left it up to the individuals. None of these guys would share their own stories. In fact, without exception, the people in these books, especially Norwich Heroes, are modest, they're humble. You would have absolutely no idea of the things that they've accomplished and the things that they're capable of. And if I would have shared with them that the working title for the book was Norwich Heroes in advance, I'll bet without exception they probably would have diplomatically bowed out of it. They're not people who seek the spotlight. When I was researching for the first book, one of the things I was most struck by was General Harmon and his biography. As a cadet, I've walked by his statue 1,000 times. In my Rook book, I read about General Harmon, but all I knew was that he was president of Norwich and a World War II hero and veteran, but I didn't know any of the specifics. And when I learned about his life, I was blown away. It reads like a Hollywood blockbuster. He's born in poverty, works his way through college, fights in World War I on horseback, ends up competing in the 1926 Olympics just on a whim, goes back to Norwich as commandant, fights in World War II where he commanded armored tank divisions at the Battle of the Bulge and the Kasserine Pass. And I was struck that somebody could accomplish so many things and yet be barely a footnote in most military history. If somebody as monumental as General Harmon can be forgotten by history, then some of our graduates who work at the more tactical level run a much greater risk of being forgotten. And I wanted to do my part to at least highlight a small handful of them so that their service would be memorialized.
how do you go, what's your approach on research? Okay, two questions here. How do you become disciplined to do this kind of research, number one, and how do you avoid going down rabbit holes?
Well, it's not discipline when it's something that you're really passionate about. You can't help yourself. And you have to, I remember mentioning this to President Schneider at one point when he asked me, how's that book coming? I had already interviewed you a couple times. And I said, man, I keep going down these holes that don't really matter, but they're just so interesting. And he mentioned that's a typical pitfall with people who are doing research. So write it as you're doing your research. And I write out of sequence, which makes it a little bit easier. And the other thing, he said, you know you're done researching when you start to find mistakes in the research. And I'll be damned if that isn't true. Because I'd be reading something, and whatever source you're reading, I'd say, they're wrong on that. They're off. And they may have just missed something, or maybe it was written before they had all the information. But you start to find mistakes in other people's sources, that's when you know that you're done. That's when you know that you should sort of wrap it up. For Norwich Matters and Norwich Heroes, both of them took me from concept to completion 10 months. That's 10 months from the time I got the idea to the time I had a printed copy of the book in my hand. Well, after you've written your book, assuming you have something that you're proud of and it's your final copy, you have a couple of different options to get it out there to the market. The first option would be to go the traditional route, try to find a literary agent to represent you, and then that literary agent will go to different publishing houses and try to sell your story. But the publishing industry is in disarray these days because they no longer have a monopoly on distribution. Everybody has access to distribution. It's just like the music industry. Bands no longer need to sign with a big record label because in the old days that was the only way to get a record made and distributed to the stores. Now you can publish either digitally or for print on demand, and you can get your book out to the market entirely on your own. There's a double-edged sword to that, though. There's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of junk because it's so easy to get things out to the market. So there's still a bit of a stigma that comes with it. If you don't cut corners and try to give your work that extra little polish, you can do well and you can sort of stand out from the crowd.
What's next? What's plans for another book?
There's some more Norwich stuff I would like to do at some point, and a few other projects that are non-Norwich related that I'll have out probably sometime this year. My hope really is that other people will do Norwich stuff, even if it's just their memoirs from when they were here during different times. And then by the time our bicentennial comes around, which is only, 6 years away, that there's a huge body of literature out there for people to pick and choose what they want to read. That's my hope.
Well, Randy, once again, I want to thank you for joining us in our first in a series of expert voices hosted by the Board of Fellows. It's people like you that have kept this place going for 200 years, and it's people like you that keep it going for another 200 years. So I want to thank you. And
my pleasure. If I get into it with them, I can talk on some kind of like
It's great. Wow.
So my plan is to just keep telling stories, keep finding and sharing great stories. And if I happen to do that through another book, great. If it happens to be a video or some other way of storytelling, then I'm fine with that as well. But I know there's a lot of stories out there. In fact, most stories never get told. These first two books about Norwich have evoked a curiosity in me where everywhere I look these days, I see the potential for a great story, whereas before I never did. And hopefully, if all goes according to plan, then by the time I retire, there will be a big stack of books of extraordinary stories to pass along to my son, right next to the boxes of Indian history that my father has passed along to me. And hopefully my son, once he's old enough, will stumble upon that stuff in the attic and he'll be inspired to keep that storytelling tradition going.